All right, why don't we start? Because we have so much to talk about, and I hope we can at least start to scrape the surface. So I don't think Emily needs much introduction, but in case anyone hasn't heard, she is a professor of economics at Brown University. She's also the best-selling author of now 3 books that have completely changed the game of pregnancy and parenting for many of us around the world, and I would say very much for the better. And she holds a PhD in economics from Harvard. She was on the faculty at the University of Chicago School of Business prior to coming to Brown. And there are many more impressive accolades that I could easily share about Emily. Welcome, Emily. It's such an incredible honor and pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this. I'm excited to be here.
And the other part of my introduction that I want to kind of speak to from a more personal angle in terms of why I'm particularly thrilled and excited to get to have this conversation. And hopefully this also provides some context for the relevant aspects of Emily's approach and background that I think give her this unique vantage point on our topic today. So personally, not only have your books played a really profound role for me as a parent, Emily, of a now 1.5-year-old, I feel like you've been at my side pretty much from the day of conception right on through today. But also somewhat unexpectedly, you've had a really profound role in my professional life and kind of how I think about my research, how I think about the teaching that I do. I teach graduate students in psychology who are training to be scientist practitioners. I teach a class called Integrating Clinical Practice and Research, which is in many ways a different, I hope, better class because of all the ways that you've influenced it, even just down to particular examples and framings that I use. And even deeper than that, this is a little bit of self-disclosure, and I'll just accept that, someday some of my bosses may hear these words and, be that as it may. I've always had a little bit of an ambivalent relationship with academia as someone who kind of straddles the science practitioner fence within my field. And I think a big part of that was a kind of creeping cynicism about what seems to pass for scientific thinking and for science much of the time. In effect, this kind of throwing around of obscure technical jargon, at least sometimes as a substitute for real understanding and precision. And the tendency, almost the expectation that we will wear our expertise as a kind of cloak, to sometimes hide what at bottom is a pretty conventional, cookie cutter, dogmatically held view of the world and set of assumptions. And reading your books, hearing you talk, following your story, it's completely and magnificently shattered my cynicism about that. Okay. And has just given me a more inspiring vision of what kind of life, what kind of mind a scientist can have, what that can look like. I know I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, but bear with me. And I think a big part of that is that you completely defy that stereotype of the cloak of obscurity, the weaponizing of science as a bludgeon against your ideological opponents. What you're doing is just so obviously the opposite of that, where you follow the data because you have a sincere interest in getting more clarity and understanding on figuring out what you want to do in your life about your personal choices. And you're taking us along on that journey. And in the process, really breaking down complex research designs in simple, no-nonsense terms that the layperson can understand and can judge for themselves so that they can use it to inform their individual decision-making in light of their values and circumstances. And in light of all that, I think it's so telling that your approach, as you have continued to follow it through in this age of COVID, has made you, if I may quote a recent Vox headline that says it so compellingly, one of the most respected and reviled voices of the pandemic. Congratulations on that.
Yes, yeah, thanks. Great.
Seriously, I think we all in this room stand in admiration and respect and awe of what you've been doing and how you've approached it. And the fact that it has been so controversial and that hasn't stopped you and it hasn't swayed you toward caring any less about the data. And, to my eyes, I mean, especially when you step into one of the most moralized, the most politicized debates in all of our lifetimes, probably, to be able to really follow the data and to care about the facts and to care about, the error bars and the uncertainties around those facts, it takes incredible courage, like intellectual courage, moral courage. And to me, like, that's a really deeply held value that I, presumptuously enough, I feel like we share. And so to kind of start us out today, I'd love to talk a little bit about what has this experience of navigating this debate around COVID in schools, like, how has it impacted your own thinking about the ways that data and values interact, and maybe, in the ways that they should and shouldn't interact?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. That's a very nice and embarrassing introduction, but I really appreciate it. It makes me happy. So thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you.
I think for me, it's an interesting way to frame that question. I think for me, the almost the hardest lesson of the last year. I mean, many hard lessons. Don't look at the comments, for example, being another one. But one of the hardest lessons was that data is not always the savior that I thought it would be. So I think if I sort of think about the discussion of schools, when I kind of came into that in the summer, I felt, even before I started doing schools, when I was initially sort of my initial data push on this in COVID was about daycare centers, was basically like looking out at the world and realizing, hey, there's a bunch of daycare centers that seem like they're open. It seems like we're kind of not learning about that. Like, let me just go and try to get some information. And I am like, probably more than some academics in a kind of like, well, something's better than nothing. Like, let's just see, let's see what we can, let's sort of like, maybe we can't get to the first best. Let's get, we're at the 23rd best. Let's like try to move ourselves up to the like 10th best or something. So, I started this process of going out and getting this daycare stuff and camps and sort of like evolving from there all the time with this idea that like, okay, just like once, if we had the data and we just like put the data together and we showed it to people, then like, it's not that we would necessarily agree, but like we could like discuss on the merits, right? We could like have it would be a starting point, and then you could say, well, I don't agree with this, but we could get a different, and then we could like we like all work together like on a team, a data loving team. And I love it. It sounds so amazing,
yeah, right?
Yeah. And it didn't work out like that. And I mean, and there were sort of pieces of that, but I think that particularly when I got into then talking about schools in the fall and getting the data on schools and pulling it together, there was a real moment of realization that was like, oh, like just because, and I think I keep realizing this, that like just because we all can like, just because the data seems obvious, actually that's not enough. Like it's not enough, or at least it's not enough for many people. And I think that's been a really, like, frankly, a really hard lesson, because I always just want to think, okay, yeah, all right, so it's not enough, but like if we got this, it would be enough. Like, okay, your data doesn't, like, yeah, I agree. Our data didn't, early in the fall, people were like, your data doesn't include enough students of color. Your data doesn't include enough urban school districts. It's like, yeah, that's totally right. I can engage on that. Okay, great. Now I've got comprehensive data from the state of New York. I got comprehensive data from the state of Texas. We've got and then, but somehow like every time I would think, oh, if we had that, if we addressed that particular question with data, we would like all be on the same page again. And I think that it was just eventually I came to realize like there are people who will be convinced by those additional pieces of data, but then the data is not everybody's friend the way it's my friend. And I think that's been a hard lesson.
Yeah. And I mean, it cuts right to the heart of our theme today and of what I've been thinking really hard about, partly as I follow your story and the larger story that's unfolding in the world around this, and thinking about, so my research is about how to motivate people to care about facts. At least that's a really big part of my research, and I think in some ways an overlapping theme in our work. And part of what I've been really wondering is, to me, as I mentioned, like, you're a great source of inspiration. And I feel like a lot of the background that I've learned reading your books, reading, that Vox article, I feel like, I'm a little bit of a voyeur into, I guess this is just, it comes with the territory of fame, I suppose. But just knowing, like, I think there was that story about how, as a high school student, like, you wrote an essay on canals and how the conventional wisdom was wrong. And it was like the best feeling in the world that, like, I know something that they don't know, right? And just like loving that and like seeking it and seeing with experience, like, how the data helps you, right? Like how powerful it can be in informing things you care about. And I guess a big mystery for me that I'm trying to resolve in my work is how to help more people to like really see that and to know it in their own terms, right? And so, like, when you talk about these people not like, it doesn't matter how much more data you throw at them, like they're going to come up with their next yeah but, and there are just certain conclusions that are like too sacred for them to really allow you to, like, has anything worked for any subset of those people?
Yeah, so I think I would separate, in my mind, there's kind of like, it's actually a bit like how people feel about vaccines, right? So there's like the people who love vaccines, the people who love data. It may not always be the same people, probably pretty overlapping. But anyway, there's the people who are like trying as hard as they could to get the COVID vaccine as quickly as possible through any means necessary. And then there were then there are like the people who will never get the COVID vaccine ever. It would seem there's a lot of them. And then there's this kind of like people in the middle who are like, they could be convinced. They're kind of like, I don't know what we're using. So I think of the data people as kind of those groups too. There's the people like you and me who are just like, yeah, this is the answer. Like every question or many questions can be answered with this, or at least we can make a lot of progress. And then there are the people who really hate data, and come back to why I find that so frustrating. And then I think there's a lot of people in the middle. And I think a big barrier to that middle group is understanding. And I think when I think about some of what, like, an understanding, like, what does this mean? And I think we see that so clearly in COVID, like things like vaccine efficacy. Okay. So like people, like there are people who like they want to react. They want to see, okay, they want to react to the data, but then there's like vaccine efficacy, and there's, oh, somebody said it's 67% in Israel, and somebody doesn't know, that's Simpson's paradox. It's actually like 95%. And for me, I'm like, oh my God, that is the most amazing. My reaction to that was like, that is an amazing illustration of Simpson's paradox. Like, I am using that in my class. Like, that is extraordinary. But for other people, they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, is it 67 or 100? I don't understand how this. And so what is it, Simpson? Shut up. Like, that's not important. Like, that's not what I want to know if it works. I don't, and I want to use data, but I'm like it's hard to parse. And I think that what we can miss, and I think this is an issue for academics a lot, is that you can get, like, it's that there's a facility with that if you are in this particular space of academia in particular, where it's just like, I understand it I understand it so immediately that the thing I'm interested in is like how cool this is, as opposed to recognizing that this would be a hard thing to act on if I didn't understand what it meant. And so I think that there's a big piece of my kind of like professional life, which is about, particularly about some of the writing I've done this pandemic, which is really about like, what is the, how do I understand these data? Right. And so and I think that's I've been doing a lot of that writing, and I'm kind of hoping that pulls some people over to the side of like, okay, like I can engage with this as if it's interesting. It's not scary. It's not something that I'm just like overwhelmed with. It's something that I can understand. And I think that's that's one piece.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just on the sidelines, watching you do some of that work, I'm so thrilled that you're putting it out in the world, and that I can now cite it, and that I can send people to it. And at the same time, I'm thinking about, so you're so right that there's a kind of shared, like we're so fluent in the language of data, in the language, and so kind of like used to being curious about these kinds of paradoxes or complexities in data that we take it for granted. And so there's a kind of theory of mind challenge there of remembering, okay, people who are generally well-meaning, people who are thoughtful, people who really do want to know, may not already share some of our assumptions, right? And it may not be intrinsically interesting to them as it is to us. So we really have to think about, like, what is their kind of stake in this? What is their, like, what do they already understand? And what's, like, how do we create the headache for which we then provide the aspirin, kind of thing, you know?
Yeah. And I think you can also ask how much can I ask? Like, you can ask something of people, but not infinite amounts of people. And I think that's a little bit of the balance, is like, how much do I want you to really, like, be able to, like, to understand why this is hard, or what we need to understand here, and how much of it is do I want to kind of like be sort of like tell you to trust me. And I think that's tricky.
Yeah. And so, like, just realizing that the cognitive load involved is going to be different, right? For someone who doesn't already think like we think, and kind of really meeting people where they're at. I guess to complexify this a little bit more, the kinds of things that you're describing that you've sort of learned and really embraced as part of this whole notoriety that you've had to take on. I work among psychologists who they teach the importance of empathy and theory of mind and, like, seeing things from other people's perspectives. And they're experts in a lot of the things you're talking about. Like, you know, if a patient is sitting in front of you, they're not already going to assume what you're assuming, you know, and they're not going to have your values. And at the same time, I found, without, of course, you know, pointing any fingers or naming any names, I found that within my field, a lot of people have been really dogmatic about kind of rejecting wholesale some of the data-driven conclusions that lead to what to them feels like a really threatening conclusion. You know, like, wait, so are you saying, but if we're going to open schools, like, isn't that basically what Trump's been calling for? And isn't that right? What, you know, what wouldn't that mean that we don't care about the little people? And, you know, it just kind of activates that module of, like, virtue signaling, of needing to belong to the correct tribe. And it totally overrides all that savvy about, you know, how to meet somebody where they're at.
No, I totally agree. And I think we got into this, it sort of, this kind of took on a different, I don't even know how to think about it. Like, it sort of, it became, I think virtue signaling is the word that came to mind most frequently, but I think it's also some kind of belonging. And I think we see it in parenting too. I think it's not different in some ways than the way that you want to, like, be a kind of parent, right? Like, I want to, like, everyone else in my group is this kind, is the attachment kind, or the sleep training kind, or the breastfeeding kind, or whatever is the kind. And this was also like, I don't want to be like the person who's, you know, not the, who, like, is the like the soft COVID denier, you know. I want to, like, we're all in it. And I think that, you know, early on there was like, we're all in it together. And then it was like, okay, we're all in it together, but, like, then are we really, like, and then it's sort of, we could win in these different directions. And I think, you know, that has been a challenge to get out of, and a challenge for people to say, you know, well, actually, I'm going to make choices that I think are right for my family. And then there's like a shaming aspect.
Yes. And yeah, so much of what I've also been seeing, I think, comes down to kind of those identity-based, group-based self-identifications, right? And
yes,
the ways that it feels like we're tearing them down. And yeah, I mean, this makes me think, when you mention the ways that this happens for parents, I remember as I was reading Expecting Better and Cribsheet, I was thinking about, in part, like, where did these norms come from in the first place? Like, clearly, you know, in the US, there's this systematic bias against having even a sip of alcohol the moment that you find out that you're, you know, pregnant, or that you might be pregnant. And, like, it's in that way that it's a little bit resistant to evidence. And so it's like you had to push extra hard kind of through some of that conventional wisdom. And, like, it's not as strong a bias in other places. Like, I actually vacationed, seems like such a, you know, distant example.
On a vacation?
Now, during pregnancy, so my husband and I went on our kind of belated honeymoon to Europe, and I had already read well past, you know, the point in your book where I had, you know, experienced that liberation of, okay, I can have a drink here and there. And in Europe, like, it just wasn't that big a deal, many places right. that we went. And I didn't even have to feel the shame that I've had to feel often, you know, if I do it here. And then I think, and same with the, you know, breast is best campaign. And, like, where did that, you know, with the alcohol thing, and maybe even the breast is best thing, like, there's a kind of puritanical holdover. There's some sort of influence of, you know, like, that thread in our culture that makes it that we kind of, like, just frown upon indulgences of a certain kind.
Yeah, I think there's that piece of it, which is like, and it's not so much of frowning on indulgences as it is like, this is my opportunity to show how much I'm willing to sacrifice. And I think that comes up comes up in breastfeeding. It's like, a way that I can show that I am committed to this activity is to do something even when it's really hard.
Bad for me. Yeah. When it's hard,
even when it's like bad.
Yeah. Like even when it puts my needs on the back burner, right? Even when, And so there's this kind of mentality. And I feel like if we look both cross-culturally and kind of within subcultures, like when is it easier and when is it harder to get that kind of alignment around, hey, we care about the facts. It's okay to sometimes be wrong. This is a kind of constant work. Like, it's kind of like there's some kind of correlation, if you will. This is purely anecdotal. I hope someone does research on this more formally at some point, but like there's some kind of correlation between ideas that lend themselves more to like individual differences and choices and just like, individuality, like live and let live perspectives that also make it a little bit easier. It's like your identity doesn't necessarily get staked on the group you belong to or how much you're willing to sacrifice. Whereas, you can kind of loosely track it. But I mean, I'm curious.
Yeah, I know it's interesting. I mean, I think that probably we could point to some sort of features of these of different behaviors that make them more subject to this. So, I think the more I care about something, and parenting is like, I just want to be right. I'm trying to do a good job with this. I want to be right. I don't want you, it's easy for me to see your choices as a kind of reflection on my choices. I think COVID has a sort of overlaid on that. Also the like kind of social, like you're going to spread it to other people. Like there is like a genuine, particularly sort of pre-vaccine, but even still there's a kind of genuine sense in which like my choices are going to impact your choices. And so it's not something I can just choose that I can just choose on my own, but there is that component of it. And I think part of what's been hard in the COVID space is like, as we've sort of moved in the direction of kind of more of there's more vaccine, and so like it's gotten closer to the idea of individual choice, but still there's a lot of overlay of, I saw somebody tweet, whatever, Twitter is the worst, but like these sort of examples, like somebody, tweeted like, I took my kid to, I don't know, some like water splash park or some guy, whatever. And like, let them play with other kids and some, and I guess that makes me a terrible person. And someone else wrote back and was like, yeah, it just makes you a person who like wants other people to die. So like, well, I don't like, that's, like you,
Yeah, so like that's out there, right?
Definitely.
Like that attitude is out there.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of interesting the thing you said at the beginning about the data, because like last night this says a lot about my psychological makeup. Here we go. Like last night, somebody wrote to me and was like, Governor DeSantis, some random, was like, Governor DeSantis used your thing to argue that there shouldn't be masks in school. And how do you feel about that? Now a lot of kids are going to die because of what you said. Okay. And so I kid you not, my instinct is to be like, okay, well, actually, like we didn't consult with our Governor DeSantis on that. And also like, we don't have a lot of data suggesting that taking off masks. Also, schools haven't started yet. It's like my instinct is to be like, well, this is something we could address with data. Like, I don't think, but of course that's not, instead you should just block that person, which is what I did. But, I do think there's a kind of like, this is kind of out there and it's not, really amenable to.
But it's a noble instinct. And I mean, I think it speaks only positively of your psychological.
I think it's kind of a weird end. It's like taking it like a step too far. But you're self-aware about that. That's what makes the difference. Yeah, but it's so. I mean, I feel like there's so many different directions that I could take this, and I will open this up to questions pretty soon. So if you guys want to start raising hands, by all means, get in line, and I'll hopefully be able to maintain some semblance of order. And if I don't, then apologies in advance. It's not personal. But yeah, I feel like another aspect of this that I think connects up to a lot of the other things we've been saying is that like there's a way of thinking about values, a way of thinking about
like choices, even like the things that aren't per se susceptible to data-based, validation, and I'm so embarrassed that I haven't managed to read all the way through Family Firm yet, because as I started reading it, I realized, like, oh wow, like Emily's addressing a lot of the questions that I was going to ask her. This is awesome. But just even the whole framing of like, now you're having to think about your overall mission as a family and how all of these different logistical pieces are going to fit together. And like a lot of that isn't going to come from, yeah, of course, data is going to be a huge input and a crucial one, but like there's a whole bunch of other thinking that you have to do. And that thinking is hard to do. And you could be better at worse at doing that kind of thinking, right? Like you could be more or less kind of thoughtful and rigorous about checking that your immediate choices are going to align with your longer term goals and values, just as a company, right? Thinking strategically could like align its mission with its actual on the ground everyday operations and vice versa. And so I just really wonder like how much of what we're needing to engage with, how much of what needs sort of championing and modeling in the culture is like that wider kind of approach where data becomes part of it. It's kind of like if you generally care about being really thoughtful and rigorous and systematic, and you realize like that's a project that everybody can and kind of needs to engage in if they're going to make responsible choices that ultimately they're happy with, like then that can encompass a wide range of like particular concerns and backgrounds and but there's still there's an approach there.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the sort of the new book, I think a lot of what it recognizes or what the approach recognizes is that the data piece is sort of a piece of it, but not everything. And that a lot of the kinds of choices we make around logistics and what we're going to do with our time and what we're going to prioritize have to do with, with our values, and the data is sort of an input, but not the whole thing. And I think part of what that ends up recognizing is that there's uncertainty, that there's sort of like an inherent uncertainty in a lot of the decisions we make, that we are not going to be able to be certain that the decision is correct, that we're going to have to make decisions with data that is like just maybe it's a piece of it, but it's not the whole thing. Which school do I send my kid to? We have a little bit of information on that, but it's like really difficult to sort of say, oh, I can be very sure based on data. I actually think part of our kind of data Achilles heel is that we are too frequently looking to it. And I say this as someone who loves data, but too frequently looking to it to have a single piece of data give us the answer. And that was like, and when my kids were in the like earlier books, there's more of that, right? There's sort of like, okay, here's a question. Should you swaddle your kids? Does it help them sleep better? Here's an answer. Yes, we have a randomized trial. We put them in a lab. We put little stickers on them. It turns out it makes them sleep better. Here's why. Great. Thanks. Swaddle your kid. It's awesome. But, then when you get to these older kid things, it's like, no, it's a little piece. It goes in with other things. You got to think about how long the drive is. You got to do, And in COVID, I almost see the same things in some of our, where we're sort of like, okay, we're looking for a piece of data. We're like, let's try to understand. We want to make some conclusions about how common breakthrough infections are. But instead of being willing to sort of take a holistic view and be like, look, we're hearing a lot of, we're hearing stuff here. We're seeing this from the NBA. We're seeing this from you. We're like, all that. There's a reason that we think there's more breakthroughs, which is that there are. And we see that in a lot of places. But instead, the way we want to present that or communicate that is to be like, here's a piece of data from like Provincetown. And here's one piece of data which can make us sure about what we should do. And that like desire to have this sort of single kind of certainty then is really problematic because people are like, wait a minute, like what, it sort of makes you seem lurchy. And I think that there's just, I don't know, we just have a problem with our communication.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about, it cuts so deep for me because several, and I'm going to start calling. So is it Shay? Am I saying your name right? Shay. Okay. I see your hand and I'm going to call on it in just a couple minutes. And then if I see an accumulation of other hands, that I'll really make sure to, cut myself short. But I want to just respond to what you're saying now, Emily, because it's so close to my heart. So from a couple angles. Angle number one, some of the conclusions that like exemplify for you, like, look, this was just, there's a right answer on it, like swaddling, SIDS, were the object of more debate in my household than like almost any other topic covered in any parenting or pregnancy book.
Yeah.
And not because either of us isn't committed to data. In fact, we're both, I would say we kind of outdo each other in the challenging of conventional wisdom based on like nuanced thinking about the data. So much so that, for example, I don't know if you remember, you've actually spoken to my husband, Matt, on a couple of occasions. He runs the company Higher Ground Education.
Yeah.
He beat me to you by 2, which I was very bitter about. So this is my redemption. But anyway, so he cares a lot about early like motor development and the maximizing of like autonomy and agency and all the kind of really like kind of, fine and gross motor like practice that comes with that. He's got this Montessori framework and he's integrated it with a lot of the other things that he's learned, including from the science. And for him, it was sort of like a real trade-off that, look, if we A, put her on her back and B, swaddle her, like she's missing out on potentially, 12 hours a night of like agential kind of motor movement and development. And what is actually the risk? And he made me go and calculate it, for which Expecting Better or Not Expecting Better, Cribsheet at this point, right, was a huge help. So I actually went and I plugged in all the risk factors, including, that I was breastfeeding as it happened, at the time, that she was in her own room. There were no pillows. I actually did them. We're not smokers, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually did the math as best I could, kind of multiplying out all those odds ratios. And it ended up that her risk of SIDS, if we do put her prone, ends up being like, I think it was something, I teach this now in my ICPR class. It was like it was much lower than the risk that she'll die in a car. And it was much lower than the risk that, she commits suicide as a teenager and just like a bunch of really bad things. And on the flip side, I actually did some research on the motor development issue to hopefully, I thought, like shut him down and make him see that, like, look, these are not comparable risks. Like, this is silly. This is eggs and oranges.
It's actually not a good frame for research to be like, I started this research.
I know. And here I am, Ms. like championing self-honesty and all of this, right? And I was totally still doing that, but I also failed to achieve my
achieve your goal. That's disappointing. Even with a terrible beginning.
Even with a really bad starting point motivationally. Yeah. And the fact is, like, yeah, there is, and I think, you probably even cite the same paper in your book, but like it matters a lot to him that there is that delay because he can see a lot of other sort of incremental disadvantages that can accrue. And so we debated it, on end. And we finally kind of settled on a compromise where we would let her be on her, and she really wanted to sleep on her tummy. So that was also, part. So we would let her sleep on her stomach while we watched as best we could on the monitor for like 4 hours toward the morning when we were already starting to kind of vigilantly, be like half wake, half sleep, wait on her to start crying anyway. And it was terrifying. And I never got a moment's peace while we were in this, 4-hour window, but like, I couldn't make a case against it at that point. And that's just an example where like, it's supposed to be really straightforward, right? And I guess, so, and then how this connects to the work I do as a teacher and, researcher, practitioner of psychology, psychotherapy, is that there are constant debates in my field around what counts as evidence, around like how we should even define a treatment. Like, should we define it as a standardized protocol because that's easier to test in the form of a randomized clinical trial? Or should we be thinking really in terms of like the techniques that we're using and the individual difference factors that usually we're only going to be able to correlate with improvement, but that might actually be more meaningful? And there's this push in my field, at least, toward the kind of simplification, toward that I think kind of borrowed certainty, that like substitute for the really complex work of like grappling with all of these many variables and all of the error bars and all of the, like contingencies and probabilities, like, which actually is the only way to do it, right? And I think even in science, like we try to take shortcuts, and I think RCTs can turn into shortcuts for people, oh, well, now I understand the causality. Yeah. Do you understand why this group did better than that group? Like, can you actually replicate what they did that was relevant, when you see a patient?
I think it's more than that. The RCT stuff is a whole another interesting space here where basically I think we get into this idea that like, oh, RCT is the gold standard. But it is the gold standard, but it's telling you the causal effect of a treatment on somebody, some treatment on somebody. right? And so that's like, that is a causal effect. But I think that then when we want to take the step to be like, this is the causal effect, then we are making a lot of additional assumptions, which we're much less likely to state, right? We're just not saying what the assumptions are. We're not saying, oh, we're assuming how, homogenous treatment effects, and we're assuming that like, all this other people's like real world, whatever. And so I think that we get, we kind of ported that into the social sciences from medicine, where it's, also has all these problems, so probably to a slightly lesser degree, maybe. But at any rate, we sort of ported it in, and then we kind of didn't port in all those caveats in some ways. So I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. No. So yeah, beautifully summarized. I could go on about this forever, but I do want to give the rest of us a chance to ask questions and weigh in. So Shay, do you want to ask your question?
So it seems like in the conversation so far, I've sort of picked out three different aspects of the problem, or maybe not aspects, three different sort of hats you can be wearing when thinking about this problem. And one of those is you have a conclusion, however based, that's not mainstream, that's not accepted, or you're trying to communicate that, you're trying to figure out how to get that adopted, figure out what are the challenges that you're up against as you do that. Another is you're a person with both the requisite background and the requisite time to sort of do a first-handed investigation of the research that's out there and come to a conclusion. And then a third, which we've touched on only a little bit, but I think is probably the most relevant to the subject of the salon, is if you're someone who doesn't have that background and or time, you're not completely ignorant, but you also just, I can read a medical study, but I can't read every medical study, sort of thing. And, so at some point I have to rely on a trusted expert or consensus, or how does that, like, what do I do as that person, not the person writing the book that you wrote, but the person reading it versus reading all the other things? Like, what do I do? Yeah. And for the very, very important issue, like whether my baby gets some time on his belly overnight and gets to start doing motor training skills, fine. Then I'll do the in-depth research there. And there I feel more comfortable on like general scientific epistemology. But what do we do outside of those spaces?
Yeah, such a good question.
I think my instinct, is to say, I think the biggest mistake people make in those, in that kind of setting is to lurch between decisions. So the sort of key thing that I think is different from like how I would approach this and how people sort of approach this without as much training is to think that we should be updating with respect to each additional study. So I think, when you sort of ask me, like, how would you approach this? And the first thing is, don't approach it until you need to, right? So like, you do not need to be an expert on all of these different things in every moment. You only need to figure out the right answer in the moment you have to make the decision. And I think when we see this sort of COVID thing, like one of the things that I think has really messed people up is that they're trying to constantly evaluate a question that they are not currently answering. So the number of people who are like, let me tell you, I need to understand right now, should I vaccinate my 5-year-old? Actually, you don't need to understand that right now because you can't. So unless the question is like, I have an opportunity to enroll in a trial, that's not a question you need to answer. And you don't need to read everything about that. You don't need to be like the current expert on myocarditis. You don't need to be like digging into details of the Moderna investigation about whether you don't need to know any of that because you don't know, because there's going to be later a time for you to answer this question. And when that time arises, you can look at all the data together. And I think this is like in the family firm, I have this sort of idea with these 4 F's. And one of those F's is fact finding. And like the kind of main thing I'm trying to communicate to people there is like, when you are ready to make the decision, get all of the information all at once. And by then, like some of this crap that you could have been reading before is going to be done, right? Like you could have wasted a ton of time thinking about something, which by the time you get to making the decision actually turned out to be wrong. We're wrong a lot. Right. So there's a lot of these like, oh, I published a study. Oh, it turns out that study, like, there's just like a lot of people spend a lot of time obsessing about like, is having a mask on poisoning your child because of carbon dioxide. They read the headline, children's masks full of carbon dioxide, constant poisoning, any moment they might die, published in JAMA, right? And then, but the thing is, mostly you didn't have to make the choice right then. And by the time people got to making the choice for the fall, it turned out that study actually was just literally completely wrong and had been retracted. So it would have been a shame to spend time there. So I guess that's a sort of only partial answer, but I think it is one piece of how to make this somewhat more manageable, which is don't try to do it all at the same time. Wait until you need to.
Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. If I can ask a kind of counter question, because I think it's actually, there's an art, I think I called this salon semi-provocatively, the art and science of science-based decision-making, because I think like there's a kind of learnable skill set involved in even kind of knowing like, when do I know enough to be able to judge this for myself? And like, when do I need to consult experts? And, like when you do come to a decision, because I think that's such great advice, is just kind of like keeping in mind your purpose and your goals and not kind of getting carried away with the like exercise, like not letting it become a rhetorical exercise, right? Of like, no, but now I'm on this like high horse of it needs to be, and then that's just a like unhelpful starting point for any decisional process, right? But when you do need to decide and you do need to, kind of base, either I send my kid to school or not, either I put a mask on my kid or, either I go to this water park. And in those moments, I feel like there's a kind of toolkit that hasn't been fleshed out yet, but that like, thinking about it as if, like the work you've done in your books is a kind of gold standard for like, if I can find an expert who breaks it down this way, like there's a lot I can watch for that helps me to know how trustworthy, right? Like you broke it down so we didn't have to take it on faith, right? And like we also didn't have to become experts ourselves. We didn't have to go and read the RCTs, but like there were all kinds of actual like there was work you did for us to help us understand what you were talking about without having to like go to graduate school. And I feel like the closer we can approximate that with our experts, when we decide which experts to listen to and what, which of their conclusions we want to take, like being able to kind of develop that like kind of meta critical, thinking process of like, how can I tell? How can I gauge credibility? Right. And knowing like certain principles of like, if they haven't acknowledged a single weakness in their position, that's probably a red flag, right? Or like if they haven't, if they're basing really strong conclusions on one study, that's a red flag. Like I feel like that's something everybody should be educated in.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing is that sometimes when we're thinking about these decisions, we can sort of, if we think about the decision, like what our actual choices are first, we can narrow more into what is the piece of information that we need rather than sort of, I need to understand everything about this entire landscape. I need to like, there's a sort of like narrowing, but I don't mean, I think that this is a hard, this is a hard, in some ways, like very, like there's a limit, right? So like, and there's a limit even for those of us who think we're great at everything, like me, on this stuff where like my dad asked me last night, like, should I take blood thinners for like an AFib? Which is like a cardiology thing. And like, the thing is like, I can read up to date and I can, tell him like, here's what up to date says about that. And here's like some, but like we're like at it. There's like no way that I can have any concrete, I basically came back and I was like, get a good cardiologist. I don't know.
Right.
Like, let's just make sure we get the fanciest cardiologist and not, and like, that's kind of the limit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that in itself exemplifies like, does the expert acknowledge when they don't know something? And when something is outside their
the fancy cardiologist, I don't know.
Exactly. So let me go to, so I'm going to butcher your name. So I apologize in advance. Yash? How did I do?
Yeah, I think Cynthia had her hand up before me. So.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait, no, don't worry about it.
Why am I not seeing Cynthia?
I'm here. I promise.
I see Cynthia.
I'm sorry, Cynthia. I probably just put my screen too narrowly.
Hi.
Yes.
First of all, big Emily Oster fan, just in general, have to get that out there. And I guess, Gena, it's kind of a question for you and for Emily. Like, I feel like people are using data as religion as a way to make them feel safe. I say this as someone who's like, sure, I probably shouldn't drink when I'm pregnant. And then I'm like, whoops, I had some beer. I'm probably going to live. Like, that's like my vibe on life. Right. And like, I'm in a lot of evidence-based Facebook groups for parenting, which are bananas if you ever want something fun to do. And it's like, well, the AAP says, like, if you don't stop unswaddling by 12 weeks, you know, you're a terrible parent. And I guess I'm interested, Gena, like, as a psychologist, like, do you think that people need to kind of like figure out like who they are and like what their values are, and then use data to drive that? Because as Emily just said, like, you can't have perfect data and perfect information. So there's going to be coming down to like a judgment call on certain things. And I'm just interested, like, how you would blend that in your life. I don't know if that's a question.
I mean, yes, would be my short answer. I do think that it's important for people to like do their own work of figuring out what their values are, what's important to them, why it's important to them, and not try to use, and again, I think all of us are susceptible to this. I think in some ways, those of us who are surrounded by data and by, you know, science are more susceptible to it, because it kind of offers this like veneer of certainty and a veneer of, you know, like Emily was saying, like having that kind of easy, unambiguous, like reliable answer that's like that it's like validation seeking, right? Like we do about anything we're insecure about. Like we just want somebody else to tell us that we're right, rather than kind of doing the work of like grappling with our uncertainty and like gradually updating our own model of like, well, how can I live with the kind of risk that's actually going to be involved in, you know, sending my kid to school, and like, what does it actually mean for my friendships? What does it mean for the, you know, for the kids in our, like, how bad is it when I just like leave my kid, you know, with a nanny for like, does the kid go stir crazy, or is the kid actually able to kind of, you know, adjust and find new ways of seeking novelty in their new environment? And like that will then need to update my view, right? Like all that, it's work that never stops, right? It's work that like we have to do. Like our data set is our life. Like nobody else can substitute for our own expertise on ourselves, right? Like we are the first and kind of most direct way to all the variables that make up our life and what, you know, what brings us joy, what brings us meaning, and those we love, right? I mean, it's kind of like in psychology, you know, when we were just talking about RCTs as this gold standard that sometimes like becomes one of these substitutes for the actual work of trying to understand. So, you know, Emily, we're talking about assumptions that are just kind of baked in to our conclusions about RCTs. In psychology, until pretty recently, more or less every RCT on which we established various treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy and, you know, its variants required that you meet criteria for one DSM diagnosis and only one DSM diagnosis. How many people in real life do those findings actually apply to? It's almost a null set. Like that's not a real person. Like the people that they had to select for their studies were like weird unicorns who like, how do you have depression but not anxiety? Like, who are you, right? And so like realizing that, look, the complexity doesn't go away. Like if you think about what it takes to understand one person, like really understand them, right? And then if you think about like DSM diagnoses that boil you down based on, you know, 5 criteria, and then base any further conclusions about what will help you on the fact that you met those criteria, like how much is that telling us about what will actually help you, right? And so just the work of like thinking through the whole complexity that is you, like there's no substitute for that in any amount of, you know, statistical findings. Okay, I want to now go to, yeah, whose name I probably am still butchering. But
No, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, thank you guys for hosting the session, Gena and Professor Oster. It's been really cool and a lot of food for thought, to be honest. Some of the stuff that I was kind of deliberating on asking has kind of come up in different ways already. So it's interesting, Gena, that you mentioned the DSM criteria, because like, I don't know what's up with that. Just sitting in like some of the psych like ward rounds with doctors, they're like, oh yeah, this person has like this one criteria, but like not this. And do they have this exact thing to fit like criteria 6.1? And I'm like, is this how this works? Like, but yeah, so I think kind of what I was getting to is like, that's a good segue into my question, which is kind of about like data gathering in what I do, which is medicine at the moment. And it's data is like, I think right now we're probably in like the golden age of data gathering and data collection and like information about data to the public. And we're kind of in that, what it feels like is that we're in that space very like, without being prepared. People have a lot of information with the internet without understanding how to utilize that information or understand it. And I really struggle with that. I think I reached a point at the start of the pandemic about like finding some information from a source that's reliable, but also unbiased and also doesn't have a political agenda to propagate like a message. And like, that's not a wormhole or like something anyone wants to go down because that's next to impossible. Like, but yeah, at the end of it, I found Professor Davy in Scotland in public health and Emily, and I found like your guys' stuff was really interesting. And the information that came out of it. I guess what I'm trying to get to in a very convoluted way is actually when we look at data, especially in something like medicine, where people really like, there's a very direct correlation to like life and death, and people are really skeptical about using anything that doesn't have like 100% guarantee of like looking after yourself and making sure it's like something that won't harm you, which is literally nothing in medicine can guarantee that like ever. And it's confusing explaining that to the general public, explaining that to a patient while also consoling them. People at the age of 70 getting like a knee replacement, there's a high chance of death and there's a high chance that it could get infected and then people get really scared. But also at the same time, there's a high chance that your quality of life could get worse and worse, but not even risking that. So yeah, it's just that we're in this space where people are really quick to get scared about information that may put them at risk. And it's about what we're talking about. People want a bias of like data that will kind of support their argument or support something that makes them feel better rather than what it factually is. It's almost being weaponized in a way. People get mad when the data doesn't like meet something that they experienced or understood. And like, I don't know, I always thought about this, and I'm like, medically, as someone that's going to be a doctor, the most useful thing for me would be that patients actually are educated on how to interpret data, or actually know something as simple as the fact that the big 4 journals are what you should be looking at, not something that you're made published in like University of Chicago for a dissertation in their master's degree. So like, I just mean that, I don't know. I mean, we've kind of touched on this earlier about people get taught stats in school, in mathematics and whatnot. I don't understand why people are not taught how to like interpret data or understand that, especially when it's so vital to everyone's life. Like everyone that I know in an educated circle looks to seek data to kind of justify what they're doing. And I don't know, maybe there's too much information on what there is, but do you think there's a space where people are going to be educated on how to interpret data? The problem is medical data is just like one in like a billion things, but that would really help a lot of people, a lot of experts, if people knew what they're doing. And like this magazine, for example, like I haven't read a magazine in like 3 years because I'm a millennial, but like I love magazines now, and like it's a lot of information in a BMJ article, something that I can like trust or be like, this is real. And I don't know, maybe the fact that there's way too much information and people seeking like 10,000 different things isn't helping. But do you think there's a space where we're gonna have data education or understanding how to interpret data? Do you think that can happen? Is that realistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah. So, I mean, I think that I sort of share your view that we should have more training in data. And, you know, I think we spend, you know, there's a sort of a trope that I think I kind of agree with, which is like we spend a lot, you know, we make kids learn trigonometry in high school, and like that doesn't come up that much for most of us. But, you know, we don't require people to learn, you know, things about like causality and how, even though that probably comes up more frequently. So I think there's a sort of space for, there's a space for that. But there's another thing I wanted to pull on that you said, which is the sort of issue of like, how do people think about medical decision-making and how do people sort of process risks? And I think that is related, but not, it's a sort of related point, but it's not identical. And I think part of what happens in a lot of those spaces is that people think only about the kind of like taking an action. The action that they're taking is salient. So the action taking is the salient choice. And then they are kind of focused on maybe the benefits, but also the risks, but like on the risks associated with the sort of active choice. That the act of, and this is probably more of like a Gena things, like sort of the act of choosing kind of means you're making a choice to do something. And so like in the pandemic, I spent a lot of time early on talking to people about the choice to send their kids to daycare. And then a lot of people were sort of thinking about that choice as like, should I send my kid to daycare or not? And that meant that like all the risks associated with daycare were like super salient because it was like risks and, you know, it was like, this is this thing and I can evaluate that being risky and I can think about what might happen there and so on. And then there was this other option called or not, which like kind of wasn't very risky. But the reason it wasn't risky wasn't actually that it wasn't risky. It was just that it wasn't a thing. And so there was a big portion of like, you know, actually what you should say is, should I send my kid to daycare or should I, you know, have my mom take care of her? Where then in fact, you're like, oh, actually, no, that's actually a terror. Like that option also has all kinds of risks associated with it. And so there was I think again, in sort of some of this medical stuff, we're sort of like, we're telling them like, you know, do you want to have the knee replacement or not? And then because or not sort of seems like this like default rather than being like, do you want to have the knee replacement or do you want to be permanently disabled? Or do you want to have the knee replacement now? Or do you want to have it in a year when you can't walk? Because by the way, those are the only two options, which then kind of means like you could be scared, but also from a decision standpoint, you're doing it anyway. And I think there's a framing on top of the kind of people that understand data piece that matters.
Oh, well said, Emily. I want to briefly comment on this, but I also really want to give you the floor, Mark. So I'm just going to kind of make one note, which is to say, it sounds like what you're describing, Emily, in a way, like are principles of sound reasoning that encompass, but are broader than thinking about statistics and thinking about, you know, whether something has an experimental control. It's like being aware of common thinking biases, being aware of the fact that, you know, like we tend to be risk averse. We tend to be inertia driven, where it's easier for us to think about the status quo than to think about how things are going to be different when we've made another choice, because we get stuck overweighing kind of like just the startup costs, right, of like having to do things differently, and we don't give sufficient value to or kind of sufficiently represent what that alternative future will look like, right? Confirmation bias. Darwin, so one common example that comes up in my ICPR class when I like take the devil's advocate position on our traditional EBP, like every RCTs are everything, you just need to go find an RCT kind of mentality, is that Darwin couldn't run a single RCT to validate the theory of evolution. There's no, right? That just like wasn't an option for him, right? Like there was pretty much no, you know, little to no controlled research went into establishing the theory of evolution. But he did things like check himself for confirmation bias. Like he has this beautiful quote about like the golden rule that he had before there was even a term for it, or at least, you know, he didn't run into it anywhere. He just kind of noticed that he tends to selectively forget things that don't fit his theory. So he's got this best practice now where he kind of like makes sure to write things down quickly if he hears, you know, new facts that feel, you know, threatening to him, because otherwise he knows he's going to lose track of them, right? Like those are the best practices. Like that's what makes someone, I think, a great scientist, but also just like a great thinker, you know? And yeah, we have to think about kind of like, what does that toolkit consist of? Okay, I'm sorry, Mark, you're on. Go for it. Oh, you're muted though.
Sorry,
yeah.
It's no problem at all. And actually, my question was related to something that you just brought up, Gena. What an honor as well to be here with all of you. How can I say this? So my spouse is a hospitalist, and I've been struggling for years to keep up with many of the things she tells me are evidence-based. You know, a lot I just kind of take as gospel. And I try sometimes, and especially since the beginning of COVID, to do my own research. I have no background whatsoever in any of this. I pull up a study, and I show it to her, and she says, well, you know, the methodology kind of seems a little sketchy there. You should wait for the meta-analysis. I pull up a meta-analysis and she says, oh, actually, that was one of the ones that was targeted by a whole bunch of zombie trials. And there was a big BMJ editorial that said that, yeah, it's something that should be kind of visited again. And combining that with my own experiences, trying to pay attention, as you were saying, Gena, to cognitive biases and my own thinking and the thinking of others in writings, sometimes it just leaves me with this profound kind of epistemic cynicism. It becomes hard to kind of take anything seriously, and not due to any high levels of competency, but there's like this French expression that, you know, you're kind of not dumb enough to start the fire, but not smart enough to put it out. You know, you're just kind of in this halfway point where it becomes hard to create a positive project or a positive image of what evidence-based can do, and what one can kind of feel confident in doing and in believing. And yeah, I was just wondering if this is something that's kind of less present as you become more competent and you get to the higher levels of proficiency when it comes to epidemiology and statistics, or if it's just something that disappears due to something else. And what happens to the people kind of in this mid-level?
So I think the answer is yes. Let me give you a very concrete example. And for me, the biggest thing is just that you learn like how data might look. You learn like you sort of adopt, if you kind of think of people as like Bayesians, where you kind of come into like any interaction with some prior. One of the things you get with this kind of training is a prior about different things. So for example, I'm writing for one of my newsletters, like I'm writing about some study that like was released in preprint last week about how like babies born in the pandemic are dumb. I don't know if you guys, it was like a headline, babies born in the pandemic, like incredibly dumb. So dumb. And so I looked at the preprint, and the effect, the effect size is like, it's a little hard to tell because it's not that well done, but it's something like, kids born during the pandemic are 2 standard deviations lower in IQ than comparable babies from before. Okay, so before even getting into all the other things that are going to be weird about this, like I don't exactly know how we're measuring the IQ of 6-month-olds, but I'm guessing that it's not great. And also some other things like that is implausible. The idea that like a sort of more limited set of social interactions in the first 6 months would result in 2 standard deviations, like that is just not possible. And I think part of it is like, I just know that's wrong. Like, that's just not right. I don't know, like, I don't, how I could explain, I could tell you all of the reasons I think that, but this, you see that, it's like, nope, that's not right. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't know what I don't exactly know how to explain, but I'm just telling you that's wrong, because there's just like nothing that has that effect. I think there's a lot of things like that in data where you kind of learn enough about the space to know something about what data looks like, something about what, the other recent example I thought of this is Gena. I don't know if you've been following this, this Dan Ariely, like PNAS, like data colada replication bananas thing.
Mm-hmm. I've even tweeted about it.
Okay, so there's this so this is a sort of interesting thing where there's this like prominent paper from about a decade ago that has now been like revealed to have been like one of the studies that somebody made up the data. But the data colada like post about it is really informative. And one of the things they show is like the outcome variable, the like thing that they're looking for effects on is the number of miles driven by cars. And if you graph that variable, it's uniform. So the cars in the data are the distribution of kind of miles driven is exactly uniform between 0 and 50,000. So there's like, a kind of, it's just like, it's uniform. And the thing is, as soon as you see that as a researcher, you're like, that is data, because definitely that's not true. But it is possible, like if you sort of hadn't spent your life like sort of thinking about data, that you wouldn't immediately be like, that's obviously made up. But it is a lot. That one's really obvious. Like, I think many people would be like, that seems really implausible. But there's many things like that. And I think that's part of what makes it sometimes hard to answer this question that's sort of implicit in your question mark, which is like, well, how would I, like, okay, so just tell me, like, what are you looking for? Like, how do I, like, I can go find those studies, and like, how do I know it's a good study? You told me like you, and there's a piece of this, which is I can tell you some of the like sort of checklist of things, but some of it is also just like, I kind of have a sense of what things look like in a way that's hard to articulate because it has many different pieces and it relates to kind of having seen a lot of things that are like this.
Yeah. And that, by the way, that is in the nature of expertise, right? Experts have assimilated a body of knowledge through a lot of experience and iteration and a gradual updating of complex priors that all interact like such that they can't always even explain to you why they're sure, but they're sure. Mm-hmm. And they're reliably sure. And I would say, well-trained experts can tell the difference between when they're actually sure and when they just like have a hunch that actually isn't that, that doesn't really have legs. Like, even if you can't, or at least in that moment, don't want to do the work of like explaining why this distribution looks bizarre and wonky and clearly can't represent real data. Like, but you know it. right?
Yeah.
Like, you know it the way you know, like, a truck's coming at you. And I think that's, a big part of the like work of building ourselves into responsible thinkers. Like, and this is where, since you brought up that paper, Emily, I can't help this little, it's actually super relevant, but it's kind of like takes us a layer deeper than.
By the way, if people want, I put that data colada, I put the like post about it in here in case people want to like entertain themselves with forensic data.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's entertaining for sure. So I've cited that paper. I know that paper because it's a paper about how to help people be more honest, which is ironic.
It's really great.
Right?
Okay.
So it's this paper about, and Ariely, like, this is, he wrote the book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. Like, this is a lot of his research. And he's, in a kind of community of social psych researchers who have done a lot of this, like, theorizing and research on the kind of ideas about the ways that we are biased and the ways that we don't know ourselves, and like tips and tricks for nudging us toward more honesty. And part of what I think is really not even ironic so much as fitting about this is I think that his model of human nature predicts this kind of negligence. Like, and this is where, I'm really like staking out a claim here, and there's a lot more to say about it. I'm not going to convince you all, nor am I making like a fully, sufficient argument here, but just as something to entertain, or just to be aware, like, that there's a debate to be had here. Like, there's a kind of moral psychology that is in our culture that I think permeates a lot of this discourse, where like, this is just what we do. We BS ourselves. We look for shortcuts, and that's descriptively true of all of us some of the time, and many of us most of the time, and all of us by default if we don't learn how to do better. But like, it's not the standard to aspire to. And I actually think like there's something really defeatist in Ariely's kind of, not like, I hate to kind of put him on the spot. He's not here to defend himself, but I think it's kind of representative of just a larger movement within the field, where there's this kind of like, yeah, we're a bunch of BS self-deceivers. We evolved this way. It's just what we do. It's how we are. Sometimes, you can kind of nudge us along, but that's really just like human nature at the end of the day. So just accept it and like try to work with it instead of against it. And like, I think that view of human nature is a lot of what's driving our culture wars right now. Like, if we think about that kind of really low bar on like our own self-accountability, our own check, like our valuing of the truth, right? Like, he's writing about honesty, but he's not that concerned about where his data came from. And why would he be? Like, he's just
it goes beyond that. I think it seems like they go beyond not being concerned about where it comes from.
Fair. Charitably. Yeah. It's like, did he not look at that distribution? Because he definitely had the background to know that distribution isn't real. but I actually believe, like, we don't know what happened. I certainly don't know from limited reading it, but like, it's plausible to me, and more alarming, I think, because then this is probably happening on a much wider scale and many differently, among people who wouldn't outright make up data themselves. That like, they're just not that careful. Oh great, and I know people. I've had colleagues for who like that easily could have been a story about them.
No, and I think there are people on that. There are many other people on that paper who like obviously had nothing to do with this, like nothing to do, like for sure, like never touched that data, never, it's like all these psych papers, you like put together a bunch of studies. But I think that there's there's a kind of lesson there, about how we trust people and how we think, and how we, I don't know. There's something in there.
I think there is. Yeah, I hope maybe I'll also write more about it at some point.
Yeah.
Yash, you have another thought? Yeah, no, this is.
Yeah, I'm happy if anyone else has a question, because I know once I'm happy to like wait, but okay. Yeah, so this is kind of, again, ties into something you just said. But I think we're talking a lot about like the recipients of data and the information that comes about it, not so much so about like the people producing that data. So in itself, medically, there are a lot of groups that are skeptical about data because of the past of what's happened. If you look at Black minorities or Asian minorities in the UK, people are very skeptical because of a lot of things that have happened in the past. They're rightfully so skeptical. So when we look at the vaccine, we look at that, for example, there's not enough data really on why. We're really quick to like crucify these people and to like be mad at them. but there's actually a lot of basis in why these communities might be quite hesitant to accept that kind of data that's very white-centric or driven towards that population typically. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I've noticed that a lot of data in academia and research in university settings, a lot of it locks a lot of people out of access. It's very inaccessible in itself, and the people who actually produce the data, the kind of the ones who have power over that, and in universities and in those academic settings, I've noticed there's a lot wrong with that, because the bias in itself is that you're kind of catering to studies or research that suits those people. It's not very holistic. What I've noticed is a lot of other people are kind of taking power under themselves. And this is something, it's a very brief trend I've seen on Twitter across a few people I've spoken to. And like, a lot of people are having this like long-term goal of like, this is something I'm super passionate about. It's super unlikely that this is ever going to be researched in a university setting. What I want is to gather enough money, to gather enough facts behind myself and create a following such that I can start empowering other people that might want to do research in this, in a setting, and give them funds or give them grants. So there's that kind of like distribution, or taking that shift of control to people rather than universities or these specific institutions. And the problem with that is the verification of that. When you actually look at media, I don't know how that's going to be taken. I kind of support that decision if you understand where people are coming from. But I don't know, how do you feel about like that kind of power dynamic or the distribution? What do you think? I know I'm in the UK and you guys are in the States, but like, what do you think is like the biggest thing that makes it very inaccessible? Do you think people kind of understand that, or do they not really?
No, good question. Yeah, Emily, do you want to tackle this one first?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I actually fully understand, but I think I have a sense of the question. It might be that I'm kind of hearing it through the filter of.
Sure, I made it a bit like confusing for you.
But no, that's quite right. It's a complicated issue. So tell me if this at least gets at kind of a core of your question. So there's been a lot of debate, at least I know within psychology, kind of tangent to the replication crisis. Brian Nozick, who happens to be my former advisor's husband, so I've kind of heard him talk about this a lot. Like, he's got a pretty strong view that like it's time to dismantle the peer-reviewed journal system altogether and like kind of decentralize. And I'm very sympathetic to his view, knowing as I do, I'm also, that's one of the few that I've heard, and I haven't necessarily heard a lot of the opposing arguments, so I'm sure there's a lot that's complicated about it. But I think like he's actually kind of spelled out what could turn into a feasible model for maintaining the quality of research. For basically, taking what I actually think works really well about like Yelp, and like, I've actually really relied on the kind of amassed data that you get from a bunch of people saying both, giving the quantitative rating, but also kind of backing it up and then being able to really, triangulate that of like, are they liking it for the kinds of reasons that will matter to me, and making a lot of that. And then if you think about how we can kind of decentralize things such that all the reviews are public, and so people's reputation largely now rests on the quality of their reviews over time and kind of the credibility, and people can really like disagree with each other publicly. And, people still have like different backgrounds and degrees and levels of experience, and that kind of, I don't remember the details of how he's proposed it, but like that can be sort of weighted, or it can be, like that information can be there for consumers to factor in. But like over time, there's a lot more transparency, a lot more accountability over all the stages of the peer review process. And the bottleneck is no longer at having your paper see the light of day, because that's such an antiquated. It's like, why? Like, we don't need a printing press anymore. Everything's online. Like nobody, like nobody reads print magazines. Maybe some do just like as a fun, but like that's not the bottleneck realistically anymore. And journals are, making whatever amounts of money they're making on a service that is completely outdated relative to what media we now have available, right? Like, why do we need them to give our papers the light of day? So there's just generally been this kind of move, and it creates a publish and perish culture that then I think actually creates bad incentives on kind of scientific, it's like, get it out, don't worry too much about, how rigorous or whether it'll replicate. You need to like pad your CV and, and then like a kind of pretense that the peer review process is like super, super rigorous. And once it's gotten past that bar, you don't need to worry. Like, I've been a peer reviewer. Like, I know, Emily, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, it's a very fallible process, clearly.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that there's a sort of more general point about kind of universities as gatekeepers for all kinds of these things, and sort of what universities, just like journals, are sort of giving imprimatur to people and sort of saying that people are experts, and that's and that is, I think, in some ways good. My sort of livelihood is tied to that system. But I think it's also, it's also been historically, pretty exclusionary in various ways. And it's exclusionary in ways that are obviously, related to race and class and gender and all those things. But it's also exclusionary in ways that relate to kind of how mainstream you are, and how, and kind of where you fit in the sort of set of expectations and the academic pedigree and those kind of things. And I think that there's, there are real conversations at places like this one around, how do we think about what we call engaged scholarship, and whether it is scholarship. And, I spend, like, at this, I mean, it doesn't matter because I'm a full professor and nobody can fire me anymore. But I spend a lot of my time writing a newsletter, and that's not a journal, and that's not it's not peer reviewed. Sometimes it's not even copy edited. It's like we're like, but on the other hand, it has a sort of particular impact, and I think this stuff, and it is rigorous, and it is some parts of it overlap in various ways with scholarship. And I think we think a lot here about, okay, what if I were a junior faculty member? Like, what if there's a junior faculty member who's doing some kind of, more engaged public scholarship, just where do we put that? We have these boxes, we have the 3 boxes, and we're very committed to which box should things go in. And I think it's hard for universities to be like, hey, maybe there's a 4th box. No, there's only 3. Okay, you have to be in one of the 3 boxes, and we're sort of, and I think that is something that in a world in which journals, this sort of journal piece is my guess is going to become less important, in which this stuff is going to be, there's going to be a little bit of a reckoning.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I think it's really kind of bringing this full circle to some extent. When I was talking about how you've given me this different paradigm of what kind of academic one can be, you've done that through your popular books. Right. And I imagine that the impact that you've had through your popular books, just completely swamps any impact that any of us are likely to. I mean, there are rare exceptions where a peer review paper becomes a classic and then gets cited for decades on end. But thinking about, and I don't think it's accidental, but I think it's earned, in fact, because I think there's real rigor in what you've done in those books, but it wouldn't count. I'm not allowed to spend my time writing a book like that. No,
and I did this. I mean, I wrote my first book as a junior faculty member, and I got fired. I mean, not exactly because of it, but not because of it either. And I think people were really upset. And they were very upset at the idea that was, that I had spent time on that was something that I was talking to that audience. And I think, part of it was because, it was about vaginas, but even I think if it had not been about vaginas, that would have been
really
would have been, yeah. And, and I think, and I remember, I think very distinctly someone coming in, after I had been fired, and when I had written something, it was just a couple weeks later, I had written something about, I don't know, Tylenol, something sort of followed up the book, and someone coming into my office, one of my senior colleagues, and he said to me, do you want to be a person, do you really want to be a person who writes about Tylenol for pregnant women? And I was like, yeah. I was like, first of all, you just fired me, so I don't think you really get to say what I get to do. Thanks for your feelings. But also, a kind of yes. And I guess that we've sort of learned that, haven't we?
Wow.
But it was illustrative for me for sort of what, and I still think if you went back to those guys and you said, look, ex post, here's what, they know, I think looking, some people have said, boy, don't you think those guys regret that? Looking out now, you wrote some best-selling books, and you're no, I don't think they regret it one hot minute. I think they'd be yeah, that person isn't doing the things that we want. That person has still never published anything in Econometrica.
Wow. And this is what I mean
never
about
will.
These are
never will.
And good for you. My God. I mean, like, these are different value systems in action,
different value
right?
systems,
Like,
but
deeply, and like, I don't think that the difference is just an arbitrary, like, take your pick. You could be them or you could be Emily Oster. Like, there's something better about being you. And of course, like, there's a wide range.
I don't think I would put it that way. I would think it's just like I do think that there is probably a space for letting people make, I think there's a space in academia for some people like me. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I should say that there's something better about recognizing that. Like, because that's the thing. Like, I think the values on which we can push for agreement and alignment are not going to be at the level of like, these are my politics. This is my preferred style. This is the kind of impact I want. It'll be at the level of like, do I actually want to know? Like, do I actually want to get things right? Because like my choices in my life depends on it. Or do I just want to BS, right? And like, do I want to make room for other perspectives and other methodologies? And do I want to take seriously, the kinds of impact people can have who are different from me? Or do I just want to pretend like this is the whole world and this is the only way to, do business? Like, I feel like that's the perspective that we can try to get alignment on, because generally speaking, people will be better off the more they can encompass that wisdom.
I think so.
So that's a pretty nice note to almost end on, but I want to make sure that we give the floor to any other questioners.
This is really great. Thank you.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much. This is like a dream come true, this conversation. And just, I feel like we've covered.
One day, maybe we can meet in person.
Oh, yes. You can advise on, whether and when it will be safe to do so.
Yeah, probably not this week. Let's put it that way. Not this week.
You've got places to go, for one, and well-deserved vacation time.
Perhaps.
To protect. Very well-deserved. But thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.